Hi, this is Ken Adams, and welcome to this edition of the Valley View, and we're going to be talking about Howard Hall and the expansion of Salem Hospital with Gene Pfeifer, who's been kind of studying the issue and is a specialist in design and building. And so welcome to the show, Gene.
Thanks very much, Ken. Pleased to be here. So you wanted me to explain how this all came about with Howard Hall. My interest in it came up in just the last year, where some of the neighborhood members, or maybe part of the SCAN, the Neighborhood Association, mentioned the problem and not knowing what to do about it. So I took an immediate interest in it. I went by the facility and thought, well, these are certain things I would do to make it look better. And so that part was easy. So if you're going to keep a historical building, you have to have a user. You can't just have it sitting there and everybody drives by and thinks how wonderful it is. It'll start dilapidating, like what has already happened to the particular facility.
Right, because it's not being kept up, and it's being vacant.
It's not being kept up. They put this big cyclone fence around it. You can't even walk up to it and enjoy the space. So I thought, if I can find a user, then that's a solution. I understood that the hospital had what they call an RFP, request for proposals, and of course that happened. We didn't know anything about it, and an associate of mine, Jeff James, he didn't know anything about it, or apparently it was something that was published wide in big magazines, or I guess it was in the Salem paper. But I went directly to the hospital, and I spoke to Cynthia Wagner, is the one I found out who was responsible for it, and said that, listen, that's all we need to do is if we find a user, we can make it so it can be proliferated and saved and usable. And so I presented that, and she came back, or I called her the next day, or maybe it was after the weekend, and she said, okay, but do it quickly. We're not going to waste a lot of time about this, basically was the address that I had to follow. Well, within 2 days, by contacting just two parties, I had two interested parties that were wanting to use the building. Both of them were relative to education, and we actually had very much excitement about it. A commercial realtor then got involved with it as well. He issued an email letter to the city indicating that he had a client that was interested. But what happened was, when I came back to Cynthia Wagner and presented that we have this interested party, she didn't follow through with it. She then said, oh, we've changed our mind. We're going to go back and we're just going to follow the path that we were already set, which is to demolish the building. So at that point, then I started figuring, well, how are we going to affect this? How can we change this course? I continued on finding people that would be interested. And of course, we just continued on that, and I followed through with the hearings that were held. I think that the Salem Historic Review Commission did an excellent job in reviewing the 4 criteria, and they determined out of the 4 only there was 3 that did not allow the criteria of it being a historical building to be changed, and it was unanimous. Well, there was then an appeal period of time, which the hospital had so many days to appeal. Well, even before that happened, the city council called up that they were going to do a hearing on their own, which I thought was exceptional. You would think that the party that was trying to make the use change would present it themselves. But anyway, it went through the council, and we feel that all of that happened too much of a political move. And so this then became the fact that they overruled the Historic Commission, and so it was a matter of how are we going to solve that. And thank goodness a blind lady that went to the school, Beverly Rushing, stepped up last week, and she said, I'm going to sign a notice of appeal to LUBA, and she did that, and it was filed appropriately this week. So that's a brief history where we are. We're hoping that with this kind of thing in motion, not to be pushing people's buttons, but we're hoping that the board, or there's 3 boards of the hospital, that those boards will start paying attention that there's a real problem with public relations in this particular issue. They can spend millions, or they wouldn't get the value back that they would by just going along with the neighborhood and the city and saying, we respect this as a historical facility, we want to do the best we can, we'll make the use that we are now alleging that would be there instead, this rehabilitation playground, that we have other space to put it on that would actually be better, or we can put it in conjunction with Howard Hall. So that's where we're trying to influence them in a proper direction.
And have these boards been receptive to this information?
Well, that's been very frustrating. We actually received an email back from, I won't say his name, but a local architect who's chairman of one of the boards. And generally words that he stated was it would be inappropriate for the board to intervene at this time when it was something that the administration was doing, and quite frankly that it was now going into litigation and that should take its course. Well, the irony to me is that a board establishes policy.
Right.
And if policy is very negative to an organization, I don't care if it's nonprofit as the hospital or if it's a big profit corporation, it doesn't matter. If you have things going on that are creating discord or litigation or other things that are negative to your company, you'd want to see if you could settle them in another manner.
Right. You don't want to be setting policy based on court decisions. You should try to work those things out before you even get to court.
Correct.
And so that has been a big issue. Now, to me, you know, as somebody that's been kind of watching this, you know, and usually I get my information on this through like the Salem newspaper, Statesman Journal. They are just presenting this, though, as Howard Hall is the only issue going on here with this property. And this property is about 8.5 acres.
Correct.
And it actually is a very nice looking park, frankly, with a lot of trees, a lot of grassy area. And they're planning on changing that from this like park-like setting with huge trees into a parking lot.
That's correct, Ken. The proposal that they have, that's another issue that we kind of feel was going on and getting under the radar when everyone was focused on Howard Hall. It was simply going to a hearings officer, and it didn't even have a public hearing. It just went out to within 200 feet of the 250 feet of the property, and those who would make some comments did, and Scan made some comments, but it was not comprehensive as it would have been if it had been brought to the public. So the proposal gives the hospital 264 new parking spaces, and that then would be the focus in lieu of clear cutting about 400 trees, or maybe not 4, about 40 trees. I'm sorry for exaggerating, but about 40. That's significant though, because of that, I think that there's like 12 of them that are 24 inches and 30 to 38 inches or something, and there's also significant trees in Douglas firs that are anywhere from 38 inches to 58 inches. Now these are significant trees, and the thing that I like to think about is these survived and be in this location through the time period when Salem was developed for the last 170 years. What did people need for fuel back a few years ago?
Or for building.
Or for building. They would cut these trees down and use them for firewood. And so these trees survived this through all those years, and now here we have a modern era where we know the value of trees and that they make oxygen for us, and of course they are good for our spirit as well. Just being in their environment, it's not just the trees themselves. I mean, it's what they do for us. The whole idea of environment is what it does for us and how it feeds back and interrelates to us and how we deal with it. So it's the Salem Hospital, I think that they should be more considerate of. They're not just for our physical health, they need to be involved and be thinking well of our spiritual and our mental health as well. So,
well, there's also an environmental impact to cutting down large trees like that. I mean, they do clean the air, they provide us oxygen. Also, they provide us shade. And as the temperatures this summer have been rather warm, the shade is, I think, something that a lot of people tend to forget about the value of trees.
Well, that's true. It's interesting. I've got it on the table there. There was a, right after certain events with some trees in downtown Salem, the city produced some documents and they put a poster up, for instance, on the oak tree that's over by the downtown fire station. They put this sign on this tree saying that this tree is worth almost $300 a year, just because of the values that it places on saving energy and all kinds of criteria. And in fact, if we had an arborist looked at the tree, or if it was on somebody's yard, the arborist would look at it and say, well, this tree may be worth $40,000 or $50,000. That's the real value of these trees, and we forget about it. We're into an age where we're so used to making decisions just looking at a piece of paper rather than going out there and looking at really what's going to happen. So in the case of this plan that the hospital was proposing, I thought as we should, is there another solution? We shouldn't just be condemning it. Is there another solution? So I looked at the contours, and the truth is that the bank where most of the oak trees are growing is an ancient riverbank. It's maybe from Pringle Creek, it may be from the Willamette, I don't know, but it's there, and that's where the trees develop. On the flatter areas, that was used for building construction. So if the design could be made so it would accommodate that, it would work, and that's what I did on this document right here. I drew a sketch. It's an overlay.
I don't know if we can really see that closely, but it's a detailed sketch.
Yeah, it's an overlay of the parking lot and the building location as the current proposal of the hospital has it. They have a building that's about 34,000 square feet proposed, and without changing the footprint of that building, the plan that I've got by making the streets curved and not so rigid, and to not be focused on a parking lot that requires this bank that I just described to have about 5 feet cut off its top and to make it more of an even grade. You just leave that bank alone, and everything about this still works. The driveways, the greatest pitch in that is it's a 6%. That's 3/4 of an inch per foot. And that fits well within ADA. The hospital was claiming that, well, they have to have this parking lot the way it's drawn to fit within ADA. Well,
and ADA
is Americans with Disability Act.
Right.
So
and that's to provide access for people that are disabled.
It provides access on an internal landscape plan like this. In our own city streets, though, we don't have. We have sidewalks in our city that are approved at 15% grade. So we just have to look at what's practicable. In this particular case, we can be very practical. And so the structure, the lower parking lot, marries exactly on the same elevation as the parking for the trucks that serve the main hospital building. Everything works very well, and the number of parking spaces, although many feel that there's too many, they can still have their cake and eat it too. There's about 100 or 260 parking spaces on my version as is in theirs. So they can have that, but we can then save, rather than saving the 4 trees that are in that area that they are saving, we can save 34 trees that are significant trees, and we can have the setting pretty much like we have it, and they can still what they want to do, which says we're not violating the private rights of the hospital, that we are honoring the trees and our responsibility to them, and we have something that citizens will enjoy for another 170 years in this significance.
It always brings up to my mind, you know, because I did work in corporate America for a long time, but a lot of times they want very simple, kind of straight line kind of things done. And it sounds like this is a continuation of that kind of thinking, where they want a nice flat parking lot with no trees, except for the ones that maybe they'll plant later on. And because it's simple for them, as opposed to putting some thought into something and making it work with the terrain that they have.
Well, I think a good part of what you're saying, Ken, is true, because they wanted to make it so it's a surface that's easy to work with, but in contrast, though, their design is very complicated on the building. It's a concentric design, and it develops over a tree, a significant oak tree. It's one of the 4 that they would be saving, and this tree would be in the center of this landscaping. And the concentric design of the building then flows around that, and then the parking itself in that immediate area radiates off of that same concentricity. But the problem is, and the irony of it is when that happens, it just wipes out a whole bunch of these trees that have been established for decades, And in fact, it'll take over 100 years to reestablish what we have. Why do that if we can make it happen this way? And I'll add this point. I've been trying to influence them with a discussion regarding form follows function. If we go to normal architectural review of how do you do a design, form follows function. So what is the function of something? They have a building for physical therapy. They want the building to work for that. Okay, it's good to have lots of windows in it so it feels good inside. But the trees on the outside are also part of that. The trees are part of the function. And the budget's part of the function. The way this has been laid out, it actually costs more money in their proposal than to simply work with what they've got. To change it, they're putting retaining walls in. It costs all the money to cut trees, to cut the grade down, to compact fill back in, all kinds of problems that they're investing in just to have something that is focused on form rather than function. And when I say form, they're focusing on this concentric building and their parking layout, the numbers of parking, rather than the whole picture of what they have. And the whole function is the whole picture, not just a building.
Yeah, you know, it's funny that you brought that up, because one of the things I noticed is that, like, when I go over to the doctor's office and they take my blood pressure in a room with no windows, it shoots up. And there's another room that they'll quite often put me in that there are windows, and I look out on trees and my blood pressure is fine. And like, I keep pointing this out to them, and they say, well, it couldn't be any different. But I think that there is a big difference about, you know, being in a sterile kind of environment with no windows, as opposed to something where you can see outside, you can see trees, you can see nature. It's much more relaxing, and it feels better, like you were saying, for your mental and physical health. And that's really what the hospital is supposed to be about, is your mental and physical health.
That's correct. So in this regard, too, this is now coming up since this particular issue has now been passed. There was a review by a hearings officer, and he accepted what the initial party had said relative to that they are granted a variance to cut down a whole bunch of trees. They have a variance as such about the parking, although the argument is by using the complexity of the whole development, the whole hospital complex, the square footage of buildings justifies more space on their overall setting. So they can do that. But to cut the trees down, a variance requires that there is a hardship. There's no hardship in this. If it can be shown that with less expensive, doesn't affect their building that they want to do, they can get all that they want and the parking that they want and still have the trees, that is not a hardship. A hardship is something that you can't help it no matter what you do.
Well, true. And now, okay, so the city council has ruled that they can go ahead with their plans and cut down these trees and demolish Howard Hall. But now...
Actually, the city hasn't done that at this point.
Oh, okay.
The hearings officer did, but the hearings officer actually referred to this plan that I came up with and complimented it, but he didn't use it to come up with this conclusion that there is no hardship. What he was saying, that this is what they proposed, and I didn't get to rebut them during the hearing, so that their rebuttal, which said that this had fatal flaws in it, remained standing. So he didn't have the ammunition to be able to say that there's no hardship. When they were saying that was a hardship was that my drawing would compromise the trucks being able to use the truck parking area at the hospital. It's not true at all. That I was changing the building so that it would actually go into a flood area. Actually, in the article that the hearings officer reviewed, I went into that point and said it could stay exactly where it is. It only affected 3 trees. The slope on the property, their slopes are greater on the parking lots than what are proposed and what I'm doing. The slopes are 1/4 or 1/2 inch per foot, whereas their major parking lot, of course this is my opinion, is more like 5/8 of an inch per foot, so it's steeper. But to just drive up that driveway, ADA requires that it be 1 inch per foot or less. And of course what I've described earlier, the plan that I've come up with, the alternate, shows that it's only about 3/4 of an inch per foot, way within ADA. It's going to be much more comfortable. In fact, it maybe could be even less than that. And the secret is we only have a change in elevation there that's maybe 7 feet. They could cut it down to 6 feet, even 5 feet. Well, 5 feet, let me give you 1 inch per foot. That's 5 feet is how many inches? That's 60 inches. 60
Right.
inches means that they only need 60 feet to create that grade. And in this particular case, if you throw a ruler on the thing that I produce, we have more room than that to do it. In fact, it's more like 90 or 100 feet that you could make work to have these grade changes. And all it is changing the grade from one lower parking lot to a higher parking lot. So it's very reasonable to do it.
Yeah, and you've had a lot of experience over the years with doing these kinds of projects. And
Yes, I have. I've done buildings that are 200,000 square feet, done many big sites where we had to make sure that the parking would work. Worked with things that were actually in flood or in wetlands, floodplains, etc., to make them work and still to be respectful of the buildings. Or to the natural setting. I make a point of, I like to do cantilevers, for instance. Now, those might be more in smaller buildings, but cantilevers make it so that you can get closer to a natural change in elevation or trees without affecting them. The footings are back further. You can make the footings in forms of caissons, which are vertical footings, rather than a typical footing is a flotation footing. It's more like a pad.
Oh, okay.
So you don't have to cut as big of excavation, and yet with this say this is a tree, you can, if the footing's over here, you can get the building much closer to the natural setting, and you can enjoy that and let it come into your view. So I also like to use lots of corner windows as well. So when the designer, the architect comes up with lots of windows on the building they propose, I say, hey, that's great. I think actually they've got too many because it's just great big whole long window walls. But there's some that are facing to the west that I think are counterproductive compared to a bunch of them that have facing to the east. The difference is that when the sun goes down, you have lots of sun that comes in uncontrollably.
Yeah, and then then your heating and air conditioning costs go up as a
Right. Well, especially your cooling air conditioning costs.
Especially this time of the year, it would be you'd be getting a lot of sun.
Right. So, but anyway, that's not my business to necessarily be criticizing their architecture. All I can say is that the building that they want to build, as they propose it, can be there. They can still use that oak tree as a focus, but they can have saved 34 significant trees rather than just saving 4.
And you did some work on Courthouse Square too, as I understand.
I was the technical advisor for the technical committee, and it was my theory of doing things in a micro solution rather than the macro solution that was proposed by the Portland architect. The county and the Chariots actually spent $1.7 million in conjunction with this architect. The architect got about $700,000 with the conclusion that it would take close to $60 million to fix it. Well, the problem with that, they tore everything apart, put steel beams in it, and then put it back together. Obviously, it's going to cost that much. In fact, I would say I would agree with them. But the problem was the whole building did not have problems, just certain elements of it. So I said, just fix what we need to fix and put it back. Just fix the, like the carpeting and some painting and some other things. In the big meeting room where the board of commissioners meet, there was only 2 columns that they had to fix in there. So they didn't actually have to touch anything else, but we had more attention that was taken with the outside veneers and some upper floors and some particular columns in the parking structure where they had to thicken the slab and do some things like that. So in reality, I presented a comprehensive plan to the board before the task force even occurred. I described what I saw as the problems and then gave them the solutions and some things I had concern about safety of, actually I gave them a point-by-point method of doing it. Now, most of what I said came out to be correct. There were some things that I found out more about the type of slabs that were being used, but even in those regards, the theories that our committee came up with for free saved the taxpayers over $35 million. So.
And it opened much earlier than I think they would have if they had had to take everything apart and put it back together like they were originally suggesting.
Sure, it happened more quick, except the politics kept dragging it out. The project was more like an 80% problem politically compared to maybe 20% to figure out what the structural problems are. The structural problems were figured out by, we had the theory, I got a hold of by internet, a company that was in Maryland, brought them in, and right over on the phone they said automatically, this is the kind of thing we remediate all the time. And so right away there was a marriage. Dalkey Construction agreed that the numbers that I'd come up with were relative as well. It's certain that the method that they use, it has to be Davis-Bacon, which we were considering in the committee, but some other things went into the act, and I think some politics went into it, so the cost ended up at $23 million, but still, it was a fixed design build project where the designers, the architect, the builder, the structural engineers were all in one contract, and they had no excuses to blame anybody else. So that's how that worked out.
Well, that's good. And the reason why I brought that up was because I wanted people to see that it's kind of almost the same kind of issue as looking at the problem and trying to solve the problems as opposed to just trying to force something in there that creates more money for certain people and like that.
Well, yes, it definitely be the case, and I don't know what the architects were thinking who advised Salem Health on particular the going back to Howard Hall. In their RFP they said that it was going to cost $5.5 million to fix a simple box structure that's mostly wood. It's got a brick veneer, and then some brick structure in the old original part. But to fix that's 11,900 square feet. That was going to cost $5.5 million to fix. And of course I read that and thought, what in the world are they talking about? You can look at your most expensive home. I designed a structure and built the Rick and Barbara Morrow home that's out in South Salem on Ballantyne by Sprague High School. That's 19,000 square feet. And I did that, by the way, in 12 months by using micro schedules. That building has nowhere near those kind of costs per square foot. And it was a very nice, it was all stone veneer, etc. So when we compare these things, we have to think of cost relative to what are we doing. We need to make it so seismically safe. We need to make sure all the utilities are satisfactory, that the utilities, that the ADA part of it works. Those things are costing less than $1 million.
So we have about a minute left. So maybe you could describe what people can do at this point and what kind of attention I mean, this show is helping to bring some attention to it, but what can people do that are watching this show?
Well, let's take the case that's been noticed to Luba. Here is a 80-some-year-old blind person who went to the Oregon State School for the Blind. She's stepping up to this. It's difficult for her. She's stepping up to knock on their door and say, hey, I'm here, please pay attention. So what we can do as a whole community is to contact the board, contact those people that are involved and say, contact the city council and say, this shouldn't be happening. There are alternative ways to take care of this that will work with you and work with the trees, work with historical building, etc. And it'll be beneficial to you, save you money. Everything will be win-win-win. I think that's what people should focus on.
Okay. Well, thanks a lot for coming in, Gene. I want to thank you for shedding some light on this issue. And come back next week to Valley View, and we'll be talking about a different subject.
All right. Very much.